For any of you that watch my video on the most complex pop song of all time, I refer to my friend Smitty, Paul Smith. He was the bass player on the gig that got me the gig, that thought, okay, yeah, we can learn this song in about 2 minutes or so on one listening. And he's the one who, you know, when I got lost in the song, he was playing fretless bass. I was like, where are you? And then the next day he gets lost in it. And I turn my guitar away and we're both laughing so hard that we can't play. So we were freshmen. That was 1983 in the summertime. He had already dropped out of Ithaca College, but we met freshman year of college. We were both transfers in, and then we were roommates sophomore year in 1981. Now, this was really an important time. This is probably when I learned the most about music, was this 1 year of living with Smitty. Smitty had this insane jazz album collection. He also had a John Coltrane painting that was 4 foot by 4 foot that he hung up above our stereo that his dad painted. His dad not only painted this painting, but his dad did all Chuck Mangione, for those of you that know the flugelhorn player, did all of his early album covers. Well, going even further back, I actually met with Ron Carter yesterday in person. He was in town. We got together for lunch. Well, Ron and his late wife were best friends with Paul's parents in the 50s when Ron was going to Eastman. And Paul's dad, for a graduation present from Eastman in 1959, painted Ron a painting called The Bassist that Ron still has hanging up in his apartment in New York. As a matter of fact, after I talked to Ron, after I interviewed him, I asked him about this, and his jaw dropped. I said, I have a friend named Paul Smith, whose mom's name is Pauline Smith, and she worked at Rochester Telephone with your late wife. And Ron's jaw dropped. And I said, and his dad, and he says, yes, Bob painted me this painting. And he showed it to me, and I took pictures of it, and I showed it to Paul. So yesterday, I told Ron about Paul, that Paul went on, after we lived together, to become a jazz piano major. He went to Cal Arts and studied with Charlie Hayden. The funny story of us living together, so there's all this other stuff that happened later on, but we're roommates sophomore year, and we start the year out, and we're in some of the same classes. Well, I immediately transferred to being a bass major when I started freshman year. So I'm a bass major, and I have this locker that I kept my bass in that Paul would keep his guitar and stuff in, this huge locker that bass players had. So we were in all the same classes, all the same theory classes and everything. Paul and I would go out and play gigs. We got gigs playing duos, 2 guitars, or Paul would play bass. He was a killer bass player. And then at nighttime, we would go down to the practice rooms, and Paul would play piano and I'd play bass. I'd play upright, and we'd play standards for hours. The main thing is that Paul had this incredible jazz record collection, and he knew all the greatest solos. So we would sit there in our room for hours and hours and hours and listen to solos and learn to sing them. That's why I can still do that to this day, because I learned all these things back then in 1981. So when I interviewed Pat Metheny, I referred to this day that I met Pat on October 10th, 1981. And I think Pat was kind of surprised that I knew the exact date. Well, the reason that I know the date is because after the show, Lyle Mays, who was the keyboard player with Pat, since I was working the show, I went backstage, I met Pat, then I met Lyle, we were talking, and Lyle says to me, are there any video arcades around here? I said, yeah, there's one right around the corner. He's like, okay, let's go. So I walk with Lyle around the corner, and he goes in, he starts playing video games. He's playing Asteroids and all this stuff. And then he turns to me and says, do you play chess? And I said, no, but my roommate Paul is a really good chess player. And he's like, oh, well, let's go play. And I said, well, we live up in an apartment up near campus, so we'd have to hitchhike to get there. And he's like, okay. So Lyle Mays, keyboardist for Pat Metheny, and I walk down to this area right in front of this club called Simeon's in the Commons in Ithaca. We put our thumbs out, and these 2 girls pick us up, and they're like, where are you going? We go to Hudson Heights, where we lived. So they drive us up the hill. It's probably about a 6-minute drive or so, and they drop us off at our apartment, C11, Hudson Heights. I open the door, and the lights are off, and Smitty's sleeping already. And he's like, I said, Paul, get up. Lyle Mays is here to play you in chess. And he's, puts his glasses on. He's like, what are you talking about? I thought Pat was going to come back and hang out. And I was like, no, Lyle Mays is actually here. And he goes, what? And he stands up and he sees that Lyle Mays is here. Well, a couple other of my buddies followed us up because they heard Lyle was coming up. I said, Lyle's here to play chess against you. And it's like, oh, okay. So they sit down at our kitchen table. Paul rolls out his chessboard. They start setting up, and Paul puts on this record, VSOP record. And Lyle's like, wow, I haven't heard this. This is amazing. It's Herbie and Ron Carter. This is weird how it's all connected, all these people, right? A couple buddies of mine show up there. We order Domino's pizza, and they start playing this game. The reason that I know the date is because Paul still has the game written down. He sent me the actual page that he wrote down. It actually says October 11th because the game ended at 3 a.m, I think. Something like this. It went on for a long time, this game. Paul was an excellent chess player, and he actually beat Lyle after a long game. And I remember that I had to get a ride back down, and the Matheny bus was waiting for Lyle. Like, where the hell have you been? He just disappeared. There were no cell phones or anything. So anyways, so after that year, Paul dropped out of school, went back to Rochester, bought a house, and started working at a restaurant, I think, waiting tables and playing music, doing things like that. But he just had enough of school. And so I finished school. I left to go get my grad degree at New England Conservatory in Boston. And Paul ended up going back to Ithaca to finish his undergrad. And then he went to Cal Arts and studied with Charlie Hayden, the great jazz bass player that Pat Metheny mentions as being his best friend. So Paul studied with Charlie out there in the late 80s and then ended up moving back to Ithaca in 1989, and we became roommates again. So Paul comes back to town, and we're hanging out together, playing gigs again all the time on different instruments and stuff. And this is a hilarious thing. I'm always talking to my kids and saying, get off the video games, do this stuff. And I was like, I never played video games. But then it occurred to me that that's actually not true. Because during my master's degree, there was this game called Gunsmoke that was at the local laundromat that I went and played with my friend Iden all the time. I was obsessed with this game. I go in and put a quarter in and I'd play for an hour and a half. Well, when Paul came back to Ithaca, we used to go to the mall every day. So I'd have my classes in the afternoon. I mean, I'm a professor there, but we played this game, this World Series baseball game, every day. We put a quarter in, and no lie, we play for 2 hours straight. Then we'd eat at this Chinese restaurant. Then I'd be like, oh my God, I got to get to class right now. But this was our daily routine, was to play this stuff. So yesterday, when I met with Ron Carter, I told him about Paul, and he asked me about Paul's mom. Is she still living? Pauline. I said, yeah, she's still living. And we talked about the painting and his dad. And he said, so what happened to Paul? I said, well, he lives out in Las Vegas now, but we still keep in touch all the time. He's one of my best friends. And I said, he ended up going on and becoming a musician. He went and got a jazz degree. And Ron was amazed at this, that his friend, Paul's parents, actually, their son, they had a son and daughter, but their son went on and became a musician. I said, Paul's a fantastic piano player, guitar player, and bass player. During spring break that year in 1981, I remember Paul stayed there in our apartment and he transcribed this John Coltrane Impressions solo. And when I came back, he's like, check out this transcription I did. And no lie, the thing was like 50 feet long. He taped it all together. He says, hold this. And he strung it out across the room. It was like 100 pages long. Okay, that he had done in pencil. This insane Coltrane transcription that he spent 2 weeks doing. I learned more that year from us sitting around listening to albums. I really learned how to listen to music. And we would just sit there and just jam out, basically like I do when I do my What Makes This Song Great, or when I make those videos, or when I make any of my jazz videos I've made recently. We would just sit and listen to music, play air drums and play air piano and air guitar, even though we could play this stuff too. And then we would practice and we played gigs all the time. And I honestly learned more from hanging out with Smitty than I really did in any of our classes that we had. Because all the theory stuff we already knew. There was nothing to learn there. Yeah, we learned stuff music history-wise, we learned things from those classes, and we enjoyed those classes. And then our classes that were outside of there, the psych classes, whatever that we took, those were really interesting. We were talking about this earlier today, and that it's 40 years ago this week that we were roommates together. So let that be a lesson. As my teacher, Steve Brown, who was also an incredibly big influence on me, he was my teacher at Ithaca, my guitar teacher. He used to say, you can learn a lot by hanging out. And that's really how I've probably learned most of the things, just by hanging out with other musicians. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. That's all for now. Don't forget to subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment. Check out my new Quick Lessons Pro guitar course that just came out. Also, the Beato book, if you want to learn about music theory, that's how you do it. And check out my Beato ear training course at beatoeartraining.com. And don't forget, if you want to support the channel even more, think about becoming a member of the Beato Club. Thanks so much for watching.